Yes or no to this statement? Science refutes God.
Thank you very much. How would one go about refuting the idea, establishing the idea that science refutes God? First of all, you'd have to show that belief in God was, if not impossible, unreasonable. And therefore, you'd have to show that all the people in the world who believe in God are also being unreasonable. I think we have here a deep fallacy, and the fact that it remains a fallacy shows that
ad populum is a Latin phrase meaning literally to the people. It refers to a logical fallacy, or in other words, a bad argument. Ad populum is when someone makes an argument that something is true because many or most people believe it. For example, Tim argues that the moon must be made of cheese because most people believe it is. Tim's argument is invalid. It is irrelevant how many people believe something. The number of people believing in something does not make it true.
And that science has established this not at some point in the future, but has established it already. Science has refuted God right now. Now, on the face of it, this is such an odd and difficult and preposterous enterprise. Why? Because actually the questions to which God is the answer are really fundamentally not scientific questions.
Doesn't mean if you don't understand something and the community of physicists don't understand it, that means God did it? Is that how you want to play this game? Because if it is, here's a list of the things in the past that the physicists at the time didn't understand. And a talk show you might have conducted 200 years ago would have said, the planets do retrograde? Can't understand that, must be a God. If that's how you want to invoke your evidence for God, then God is an ever-receding pocket of scientific ignorance that's getting smaller and smaller and smaller as time moves on. So just be ready for that to happen, if that's how you want to come at the problem. So that's just simply the God of the gaps argument. It's been around forever.
Here's what I mean. Here we are as human beings, we're thrown into the world. And we can't help, if we're curious, if we're thoughtful, to say, first of all, why is there a universe? Second, what's our purpose? What are we doing here? Third, what's going to come after? We're going to die, but what next? Now I ask you, what are the scientific answers to those questions? And in fact, the answers are, from science, don't have a clue, don't have a clue, and don't have a clue. Why? Because none of those questions is amenable to being decided empirically. Science can show how we got a universe, but not why. On the question of what our purpose is here, science is completely silent. Moral issues are in a way outside the province of science. Why? Because science deals with what is, and morality is what ought to be. And finally, on the question of what comes after death, what possible empirical evidence can science provide on either side of that question?
There's a false assumption about science operating here. Science is not in principle committed to the idea that there's no afterlife, or that the mind is identical to the brain, right, or that materialism is true. Science is completely open to whatever in fact is true. And if it's true that the consciousness is being run like software on the brain and can, by virtue of ectoplasm or something else we don't understand, can be dissociated from the brain at death, that would be part of our growing scientific understanding of the world if we could discover it. Now, and there are ways we could in fact discover that if it were true. The problem is there are very good reasons to think it's not true. And we know this from now 150 years of neurology, where you damage areas of the brain and faculties are lost. And they're clearly, it's not that everyone with brain damage has their soul perfectly intact, they just can't get the words out. This is everything about your mind can be damaged by damaging the brain. You can cease to recognize faces, you can cease to know the names of animals, but you still know the names of tools. I mean, the fragmentation in the way in which our mind is parcellated at the level of the brain is not at all intuitive, and there's a lot known about it. And what we're being asked to consider is that you damage one part of the brain and the mind, something about the mind and subjectivity is lost. You damage another, and yet more is lost. And yet if you damage the whole thing at death, we can rise off the brain with all our faculties intact, recognizing grandma and speaking English. Now,
so because science is in no position to refute God, what we get from the other side is pop psychology. And we've been getting pop psychology from atheists for several hundred years. It's an effort to explain why people believe instead of providing any kind of a real refutation. You remember a few decades ago, Freud basically said that God and religion could be dismissed as wishful thinking. We wish for a better world, and so we make one up. Well, that would kind of explain heaven, which satisfies wishful thinking, but it really wouldn't explain why major religions have invented hell. Who would wish for that? Hell is a lot worse than diabetes or the suffering we have in this life. And then you hear people like Richard Dawkins say, well, belief in God depends on where you're born. If you're born in Afghanistan, you're going to be a Muslim. If you're born in Tulsa, Oklahoma, you're likely to be a Christian. Michael Shermer alluded to that a little bit when he talked about multiple gods. But the sociology of the origin of belief says nothing about the truth of a belief. I'm sure that people who are born in Oxford, England, are more likely to believe in Darwin's theory of evolution than people who are born in Oxford, Mississippi. I'm sure people who are born in New York are more likely to believe in relativity than people who are born in New Guinea. What does that say about whether evolution or relativity is true? Nothing. The genesis of a belief, how you came to it, has nothing to do with whether or not that belief can be sustained as a matter of argument. And therefore, you'd have to show that all the people in the world who believe in God are also being unreasonable. The reality is, and we keep hearing a lot about Darwin, because the last good argument against God came out in the 1850s. Science has made a whole bunch of discoveries since then, but they point in the opposite direction. And therefore, what you find very often from atheists is now highly complicated defensive maneuvers to account for things that atheists resisted all the way. When the discovery of the Big Bang came, this, by the way, was at a time when most scientists believed the universe was eternal. The steady-state universe was the prevailing doctrine of American and Western science. So it came as a shock that the universe had a beginning. Why? Because in a way, it wasn't just that matter had a beginning, but space and time also had a beginning. In other words, this was something that the ancient Hebrews had said thousands of years ago, and without conducting a single scientific experiment. By the way, this is not the same as other cosmologies. Other ancient cosmologies posited the universe being fashioned by a kind of carpenter god who made it out of some pre-existing stuff. But the ancient Hebrews said, no, first there was nothing, and then there was a universe. By the way, that's almost identical to what Lawrence Krauss said. First there was nothing, no particles, no energy, no laws, and then there was a universe. Completely consistent with what Christians believe.
And the answer is nothing isn't nothing anymore in physics. Because of the laws of quantum mechanics and special relativity, on extremely small scales, nothing is really a boiling, bubbling brew of virtual particles that are popping in and out of existence in a time scale so short you can't see them. Here, by the way, is actually an animation that was shown at the Nobel Prize ceremonies about 5 years ago by a friend of mine who happened to win the Nobel Prize for developing the theory that produced this.
And exactly said by the ancient Hebrews thousands of years ago without doing a single experiment, but solely on the basis of God told us. And the astounding fact is that 2,000 years later, modern science, after climbing round and round the mountain, has arrived at the top only to find a bunch of theologians who have been sitting there for centuries.
You mind if I laugh in your face?
Our opponents, I'm pretty sure, are going to argue first that one aspect of science that supports perhaps the belief in God is this notion that the universe is apparently fine-tuned for life.
The fine-tuned universe has become now a tremendous embarrassment to atheism. Why? Because ultimately it shows that the laws and constants of nature are fine-tuned, not only for the existence of life, but specifically for human life.
That is a remarkable and, in fact, cosmic misunderstanding. I want to point out that, in fact, the universe isn't particularly fine-tuned or conducive to life. Most of the universe is rather inhospitable to life. And in fact, perhaps the biggest fine-tuning problem in my own field of cosmology, something I'm in fact very proud to have proposed in a sense, is that the energy of empty space is not zero. The weirdest thing you can imagine, that empty space weighs something. But remarkably, the energy of empty space is 120 orders of magnitude smaller than we would naively predict. And if it were much bigger than we measure, it's true that galaxies couldn't form and planets couldn't form and intelligence squared debates couldn't happen. So the universe appears to be here because intelligence squared is here.
So unlikely is the coincidence of all the forces being just right that many have argued the universe must have been fine-tuned by an intelligent being to allow for our existence. Now let's for a moment ignore all the lions, tigers, bears, and sharks that want to eat us. Let's ignore all the bacteria and viruses that want to infect us. Let's ignore all the poisonous snakes, fish, plants, and mushrooms that would kill us after just one bite. Let's ignore the forest fires, blizzards, tornadoes, tsunamis, hurricanes, avalanches, earthquakes, landslides, and volcanoes that can also kill us. Let's ignore the fact that if we fall from a height greater than 10 meters, or if we're submerged underwater for more than 10 minutes, we're likely to die. It turns out less than 0.5% of the Earth's total volume is capable of sustaining human life. Meaning, even if we imagine Earth to be the Eden we know it's not, more than 99.5% of it would kill us rather quickly. It turns out less than 1 billionth of 1 billionth of 1 billionth of 1 millionth of 1% of the universe is habitable for human life. Or to put it another way, 99.99999999999999999999999999999999999999999999999% of the universe is not habitable for humans. Really kind of takes the wind out of the sails of the universe is fine-tuned for human life argument. It's equivalent to a person after exploring 3.6 billion rocks like our moon and discovering only one single virus particle on only one of the moons, claiming that collectively they're fine-tuned for life.
That claim of fine-tuning is ridiculous because, in fact, if the energy of empty space was zero, which is by far a more natural value, the universe would be a better place for life to live. We all thought it was zero when I was a graduate student because that was a natural value. If it was zero, the universe would be a better place. In fact, you can show the value that it has now makes the universe the worst of all possible universes to live in for the future of life. So much for a universe created for us.
I want to note that this is an argument completely immune to Darwinian attack. This is not about whether the horse, the dog, and the wolf had a common ancestor. Let's remember that evolution, powerful theory as it is not a theory of life. It is only a theory of transitions between life forms. It's not about the origin of life. It's simply about how life form A gave rise to life form B. And the fact is that there have to be certain conditions, self-replicating cells, and an old universe, an old Earth, that are necessary for evolution to take place. In other words, the fine-tuned universe is a precondition of Darwinian evolution itself.
It's the same kind of misunderstanding that led people to believe in special creation for life on Earth before Darwin. It looked like everything was designed for the environment in which it lived. But what Darwin showed us was that a simple proposition, namely that there's genetic variation among a population combined with natural selection, meant that you didn't need supernatural shenanigans. That in fact, all the diversity of life on Earth could arise from a single life form by natural law.
We are living at a time when religious believers do not need to be afraid of science. They should, as I do, embrace science and welcome science because correctly understood, far from pointing away from God, science thrillingly points to God. Thank you.
Now, to refute God means refuting several claims. One, that are all based on faith, not evidence. One, that God is necessary. Two, that there is evidence for God. And three, that belief is rational. And the point is that the progress of science has shown over and over and over again that the answers to all those three questions are no, 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 no.
What is being called science is actually hiding behind a philosophical principle. It was the philosopher Hume who pointed out 200 years ago that from no amount of empirical generalizations, however large, can you draw a general law that is true as a matter of logic. What I mean is, it doesn't matter how often you measure something. Let's say you measure the speed at which this pen falls down. You can measure it 1,000,000 times, but you don't know that on a star 10 light years away or in some other condition where you haven't measured it, that if you drop this pen, it will fall at the same speed. Science presumes it. It doesn't prove it. Hang on, let me finish.
We measure it.
Let me finish. Right, but you can't measure it always and everywhere, and you haven't measured it 10,000 years ago. You're assuming that 10,000. No, you're assuming that 10,000 years ago it happened at the same speed, and your measurement is based on that. So Hume's point is this: science provides general propositions based on experience, but he said we should always be willing to accept new experience that proves the opposite.
The laws of physics are deterministic. The Schrödinger equation, which is the basis of quantum mechanics, is a second-order differential equation. And therefore, the laws are deterministic. Our observations aren't deterministic, but the underlying laws are deterministic. Nothing's changed in 400 years. And so it's really important to recognize there's no way...
The universe isn't deterministic.
Wait a minute.
It's governed by quantum mechanics.
Just one thing. Just give us a working definition of the word deterministic. You mean...
You start with an initial condition for the equations of quantum mechanics, and the evolution of the system is determined unambiguously.
It has
with
to
no
happen.
uncertainty. Your measurement of the system has uncertainty, but the evolution of the underlying system is completely determined.
I'll accept the slight correction.
If there was ever a miracle that happened, and tell me one that happened, that you can show happened.
Let's let Michael Schumer.
But even so, even if there was one, aren't you curious as a scientist how God performed the miracle, what forces of nature she used and so on to make it happen?
Of course. And so, for example, so we would say as Christians, for example, that the Big Bang, the creation of the universe, was a miracle. Why was it a miracle? Because it used no known law of nature. It was, in a sense, supernatural. The universe is all...
But that's just because you didn't understand it.
But actually, no, but you haven't... See, here's the thing. When we talk about experiments and reproducible things, you're talking, for example, let's take, for example, are there beings on other planets? Right? It's an empirical question.
In principle, it's an empirical question, yeah.
Empirical question. Right now, there is no evidence that there are creatures in outer space.
Yes.
Therefore, have you refuted that belief?
No, but it's not an illogical one, like the notion that...
you haven't refuted it because you haven't refuted it because you haven't produced...
It doesn't require me to suspend the laws of physics in order to believe it.
But if I were to believe in creatures in outer space, I wouldn't be irrational, would I?
No, but you've got to respond to the point he just made. It does not require a suspension of the laws of physics in order for you to believe there are creatures in outer space.
Right, and I would say it doesn't require
But miracles do.
No, miracles simply say that the laws of physics are incomplete, that the laws of physics are generalizations that reflect the limits of human knowledge. The creation of the universe was a miracle. Why was it a miracle? Because it used no known law of nature. It was, in a sense, supernatural. These aren't nature's laws, they're Newton's laws, and it took an Einstein to modify them.
So when the sun stood... So these biblical scientists who thought that the sun went around the earth, because that's what they thought when they were writing. When the sun stopped in the sky, of course, had the sun been going around the earth, that would be fine, but we now know that actually the earth goes around the sun, and the fact that the sun moves in the sky is the fact that the earth rotates. So had the sun stopped in the sky, the stopping of the rotation of the earth would have produced forces which would have destroyed all life on the planet. But that somehow doesn't violate the basic classical physics, and every now and then that's possible.
Well, who are these biblical scientists you're talking about?
You know, the horn blowing, the sun stopping.
The people who thought that the earth was the center of the universe and the sun went around it were Christians who, like non-Christians, were taught by scientists. That's where they got the idea. They weren't biblical scientists. They got it from you guys.
Miracles in your particular religion, it's kind of remarkable that these violations of the laws of nature only occurred before video cameras and intelligence squared and the internet, and that you have these remarkable violations of the laws of nature in a book which I was really surprised to hear Dinesh call a scientific document, the Bible. I hope he really didn't mean that. St. Augustine would be very upset with you because he said the Bible wasn't scientific. But these these violations of the laws of nature only occurred at a time when there was no evidence for them.
But Lawrence,
and you believe it.
Lawrence,
Like a popular thing at Skeptic Magazine is psychics and people that can telekinetically move objects with their mind or so on. And there's an example of this where there's a man who can move the cursor on his computer just by thinking about it. Now, it turns out he's a quadriplegic and he has a chip in his brain that enables him to do this. But if you don't know about the chip, it looks like a miracle. Once you know the technology, it's no longer miraculous. This is Arthur C. Clarke's third law. Any sufficiently advanced technology is indistinguishable from magic. I contend that there's no such thing as the supernatural or the paranormal. There's just the natural, the normal, and the stuff we haven't explained yet. When something unusual like that happens, we should go searching for the mechanism behind it. Is there a chip in the brain? So if it's true that, say, God heals cancers or whatever due to prayer, this should be a measurable thing, because this is what we do.
What
in
about
science.
Dinesh's point that just because something has happened 10,000 times and that's your case, that it's always going to happen? And he's saying logically, you don't actually know that it's always going to happen just because it's happened 10,000 times.
Science doesn't say that. In fact, that's very important. Science, I agree with you in that. Science can only prove what's wrong, not something that's absolutely true. So you're right. I can't, if I drop a ball 1,000,000 times and it falls, I in principle could imagine an experiment where it wouldn't, but that's highly likely it's going to fall the next time. But you use the key word, experience. We wait then for an experience that contradicts the known laws. So if tonight when I looked up at the sky, the stars rearranged themselves and said, I am here, in Aramaic or ancient Greek or whatever you want, then I might say, you know, there's something to it. But the point is there's been no experience that violates the fact that the laws have existed throughout all time. Our logic is determined by nature, not by what we'd like. And nature has told us that miracles don't happen. That's it. It's not what I want or what I think should be rational. It's do they happen? And there's no evidence that they've ever happened.
There are some questions in which Christians and religious believers are making factual claims. God made the universe. It's a factual claim. Either he did or he didn't. There is life after death. We may have no way to find out, but that's a factual claim. Either there is or there isn't. The resurrection happened. Either it did or it didn't. Now, religion also makes moral claims. This is how you should live. This is a happy life, and so on. So religion operates in two domains. The second domain is untouchable by science. Science can try to give accounts of how morality originated, but that's not the same thing as what you should and shouldn't do.
Well, be more clear about that distinction. I want to go straight to the other side about that.
Well, science can say that we evolved a desire for cooperation out of Darwinian evolution. Mm-hmm. But that doesn't say if there's a famine in Haiti, if I should give money or no. So in other words, the content of morality is unaffected by science, although science can give an account of the origin of morality.
But not the what is actually right or wrong. So
yeah, and the other thing
let me before you move on, let me go to Michael Shermer on that.
Well, so where do we get our morals from? It can't be from the Bible, because almost nobody obeys, certainly not the Old Testament, and most of the New Testament. I mean, death penalty for adultery, there goes half of Congress. I mean, nobody is going to do this, right? So we pick and choose, we cherry pick from the holy books based on something else that's happened that I referenced in my opening statement of there's been this other change that's happened, this secularization of morality. That is, you have to actually have good reasons for why you hold certain moral principles, and you should be able to articulate them. And so that's been the change there. So even if you and I both listen to the still small voice within to decide what's right or wrong, Dinesh, I'm claiming you're not getting it from the Bible, and I'm not either. We're getting it from somewhere else. I think we've evolved this propensity to have moral emotions, and then culture tweaks them, and we've been getting progressively more moral.
But what's telling us what is actually right or wrong?
But I think science does tell us what's right and wrong.
Sorry, Lawrence Krauss.
I think science does tell us what's right and wrong in a real way.
Really?
We have learned, for example, the scientific facts that certain animals can suffer, for example, affects our decision of how we should treat those animals, whether we should eat them or not eat them, or the scientific evidence that certain people of certain colors don't have different intellects, different capabilities, has changed the way we deal with other humans.
But at bottom,
science has determined the way we behave in the modern world.
And science is telling us what's right or wrong.
Yeah, I think so, because it's telling us how the world actually works.
I'll answer that.
Dinesh,
First of all, we don't get, none of us, morality from the Bible. It's not like I read the 10 Commandments and went, oh, stealing is wrong. Wow, didn't know that before. Killing is wrong. Incredible.
Exactly.
I already knew that.
Okay.
How did I know it? I knew it because of what Adam Smith calls the impartial spectator, the voice of conscience. So it is the contention of religious believers that the voice of conscience has been implanted in us by God. Now, you say it's come from evolution, and we say it could have been implanted in us by God through evolution. Now, just to say that science tells us facts doesn't mean that science changes our morality. If I were to step on the stage and stomp on a dog, there'd be a universal wave of revulsion in the audience, although presumably the matter would be more controversial if it were a cat. But science, my point is science can tell us the dog feels pain. But the idea that we shouldn't cause pain to others, that's a moral proposition. Science is merely altering the fact which puts that moral principle into motion. So we have widened our circles of morality based upon new facts, and science can provide those, but science isn't actually telling us what's right or wrong at all. I think there's a presumption that science explains the material world, and science does it with material explanations.
Do you agree with that? Yes or no?
Yeah.
Yes, okay.
Physical causes have physical...
Okay,
Exactly.
Go on, Dinesh.
So it is a presumption of modern science, not a proof, but a presumption that beyond the material world, there is nothing. So take, for example, the fact that as humans, we experience consciousness. We know that there's something in us, consciousness, that can't be reduced simply to materialism.
How do you know that?
Hold on a second. No, hold on a second. When you say, how do you know that, you're presuming that it is. Do you agree that the cause of consciousness is not known?
The fact that something is not known does not imply it's God. You better not get
Right,
that
but
out.
neither... So consciousness is an immaterial thing that may have a material explanation, and the key word is may. And yet you as a scientist believe it does.
I don't believe anything. I just want to
You just said that all causes are material.
I'll wait for the experiments and the theory.
Okay. So in other words, you're presuming...
Watch out.
Well... I'm simply saying, as a scientist, you are closed off to the possibility of non-material explanations, true or false?
No, I told you, if the
You're open to
stars
them?
moved around today, I'd be really thinking there's some intelligence in the universe. There's just never been such an observation. And until there is, I'll assume the reasonable, logical thing, since there's never been such an observation, there's unlikely to be one. That's all. As a scientist, I can say what's likely and what's unlikely. I don't believe anything. I can say, is this likely or unlikely? That's all.
Dinesh.
I think this is very important because throughout your book, this is called A Universe from Nothing. I have it right here. I recommend
What's the name
it.
of your book,
It's a very useful primer on the limits of science. Here's why.
Absolutely, the universe.
So to quote a sample line, and there are many like this, you say getting something from nothing, and then you say, this is how our universe could have arisen. And then you say, I stress the word could here because we may never have enough empirical information. Next page you say, these are useful operational efforts to describe how a universe might actually have originated. Here's my point. You're invoking coulds and mights and maybes to provide a refutation. Now, even if you were successful in saying that I have an alternative possibility to God, you haven't refuted God. You've simply given an alternative possibility. So you have all these qualifications in the book, but then when you step up here, you act as if science has demonstrated that the universe did in fact come from nothing, whereas you say it never did. You have not made that demonstration, and you admit it.
When I was up there, I said it was plausible. And plausible is remarkable because everything that's you've talked about in terms of religion is implausible. So the point is that just like with evolution, a simple plausible assumption appears to work is remarkable and we're celebrating. And so the reason I say could and might is because I'm honest. And also because I haven't presumed the answer before I ask the question.
Could you respond to Michael Shermer's assertion that in fact each of you are atheists 999 times over, and your adoption of Christianity is merely a happenstance of the culture in which you grew up? And does that itself not strain the credibility of your faith itself? Could you respond to that?
Dinesh D'Souza.
Well, first of all, in my case, that is flatly untrue because I was born and raised in India, and the majority religion of India is Hinduism. The second largest faith are the Muslims, and then you have the Jains and the Sikhs. So from a very young age, the Christianity in which I was born was problematic and had to be measured against other possibilities. But once you begin to study the other religions, you discover something very interesting, and that is that there are shared propositions of the different religions that point to core truths. One scholar described it very well. It's sort of like you have a mountain, and at the top of the mountain you have God, but no one can see him. And you have little rivers of knowledge pouring down, and some of the rivers may begin high, waterfalls may begin higher or lower, and you can look at the different religions as human attempts, flawed, to apprehend the same reality. These attempts will disagree on certain particulars, but agree on many fundamentals. So I don't see the other religions as wrong. I see all of us in a human enterprise to try to gain knowledge that seems beyond the reach of the empirical.
So you just eloquently described the geography of religious beliefs of India. When Lawrence goes to lecture in India, he doesn't discover that they do physics differently in India. They do physics everywhere around the world the same. There's just one physics. There's not, Indian physics and Australian physics and so forth. There's just one physics. That's the larger point.
This is a question to Ian and Dinesh. Is there an observed phenomena for which the religious explanation has progressed ahead of the scientific explanation in terms of plausibility?
I'll answer that.
Dinesh D'Souza.
If you look at the Bible, it is not a science manual. It doesn't claim to make scientific proofs. In fact, what's interesting about the Bible is it doesn't make proofs at all. The Bible doesn't even attempt to prove God. It doesn't try to prove that Jesus is the Son of God. It asserts things. Why? Because for the most part, what the Bible is doing is it's in the province of revelation. Now, you'll notice that neither of us have ever in this debate appealed to the Bible to support any argument that we've made. We have argued on the basis of reason alone. Now, the Bible does make certain claims about the world and about man. So, for example, the Bible doesn't say that God made man out of nothing, but it does say that God made the universe out of nothing. It says that it made man out of some other stuff. Now, so the Bible says God created the world and God created man, but the Bible doesn't say how. So that's where science comes in. Science can, and the scientific answer often changes, attempt to give explanations that actually don't refute the Bible. You could refute the Bible by showing that actually the universe has always existed and doesn't require any explanation whatsoever. You could show that God didn't make man out of the clay of the ground, but as Richard Dawkins said, aliens brought man from outer space. So you can actually refute propositions that are stated in the Bible. But I think Ian's right that no central proposition has ever been refuted, let alone today.
Lawrence has had his head in his hand listening.
Well,
to
I
this
mean,
argument.
you don't really want to go here, Dinesh. So I would say, for example, we refute the Bible by arguing that creating day and night before you create the sun is pretty silly.
Well, Lawrence, in that case, here's the problem. You have a fundamentalist reading of the Bible that is maybe subscribed to by 3% of Christians and 100% of atheists.
You just gave a fundamentalist. No, but you just. I'm sorry. Why I brought that up because I thought you were essentially repeating a fundamental assertion that somehow the Bible makes some scientific claims that are substantial, and the whole point is. You don't want to go there because you and I know that a fundamentalist interpretation of the Bible leads to nonsense. We both agree about that, right?
We both agree that there are fundamentalist factual claims that are so-called creation science that are nonsense. We agree on that.
So that case, the science refutes those claims.
Absolutely.
Okay, well, you just answered.
So right now, when we deal with war, all Western war is conducted according to the principles of the just war. That's why, for example, after 9/11, when America was bombing Taliban targets, we were dropping food to feed civilians on the enemy side. Now, where does the idea that you can kill combatants but not civilians come from? Did science teach us that? Nonsense. It comes straight out of Christianity, the principles of the just war that guide the knowledge of how we act today.
The point is that you can't decide what is right or wrong unless you know the consequences of your actions. Science determines the consequences of your actions. So a precursor to determining what's right or wrong is to know how the world really works. For example, if you thought the person who was pushed on the train would be hit by the train and then get up and walk away, you'd have very different actions. And so that's what I mean by ultimately understanding how the universe works is a precursor to making decisions, to making moral decisions.
That I think people's experiences are real, absolutely. I think most people don't just make up stories, although some do. Most people, when they experience, or they describe some miraculous, fantastic spiritual experience that they've had, they really mean it. Now, so the question is, what does it represent? Something out there in the world or something inside the brain? Well, we now know enough about neuroscience to know that the brain does generate a lot of these kind of spiritual experiences, near-death experiences, out-of-body experiences, sense presences, hallucinations, delusions. There's whole books about this, and so the experiences are real. What we want to know as scientists is, well, what do they actually represent? I mean, we know we can replicate these in the lab by doing certain things and causing people's brains to have these experiences. So most likely, the what's more likely question, that it's out there or that it's in here, the overwhelming evidence is that they're in here.
Good question, and I want to actually take it to the other side. Michael's basically arguing that some of those things that you're talking about, it's your brain talking to you, but not in the way that you think it is. Dinesh,
Well,
Susan.
Hallucinations, yes. I mean, if someone said that they saw a UFO, I would say, how do you know? And they might say, well, I was with my buddies. We were sitting outside our trailer park. We were drinking beer. And I would say, well, yeah, I probably won't believe that. But we're talking here about an experience that has been had by perhaps 90% of people in the world from the beginning of time. That's a different standard.
What experience do you mean? Having a sense of spiritual connection?
Having a sense of some experience of God,
okay.
right? So I would put the likelihood this way. If we went to a village and there were 100 people in the village and 95 of them said that they knew a guy named Bill, and there were 5% of the guys who said, nah, and 3 of them thought that the other 95 were lying or made them up. Which is more likely? That there is a Bill, and yet 95% of people are hallucinating? Or is it that there is a Bill and 5% just don't know the guy? The universality of the experience of God puts a heavy burden of proof on the other side to show that the mass of the human race, not in some incidental, but a central aspect of their lives. Remember, people invest money in religion, they go to church, they leave inheritances, they follow the credos of religion, that they are all hallucinating?
Who said wow?
This
Stan,
seems
do you
a
mind
little preposterous.
turning your wow into a question if we bring a mic to you? You don't mind? Sorry? Oh, yeah, right. That was just your guffaw. Okay. All right. I would love to have heard you. Sir,
Well,
right behind you.
The quick answer is that there are bills, and we've seen bills.
Michael Shermer.
So that's different than an invisible God that may or may not exist.
And the point is, when you say the experience, you mean a personal, some internal perception that God exists. And the fact that something is maybe relatively universal suggests that we may be programmed to believe in certain things, but it doesn't mean they exist. Just because, as Michael was talking about earlier, our evolutionary history programs us to have certain tendencies, and there's no doubt you'd be crazy to suggest that humans don't have a tendency to be religious. That would violate evidence of reality. So the fact that humans have a tendency to be religious is not, or belief in God, is not proof that God exists. It's just proof that humans have a tendency.
Okay.
You ask if it is scientific, and I would say no. Faith is not scientific, but faith is completely rational. Why? Because where empirical evidence can't go, it's not unreasonable to believe on faith. Let's say, for example, you're making any kind of a decision, whether to invest in Brazil or whether to propose marriage. You bring in all the evidence you can. And yet, if you're asking the question, will I make money? Or what will life be like with this woman over the next 30 years? You're never going to have a full answer. Now, you can say, I'll be an agnostic and wait for the data to come in, but the data will never come in. She'll marry someone else, so you'll both be dead. So you put in all the knowledge you can, and the leap of faith is a completely rational bridge from knowledge to action.
Lawrence Krauss.
That's good. As I said, in science we talk about likely and unlikely. In science, of course, and in life, we do, I agree, make decisions based on incomplete evidence. But the wonderful thing about science, the thing that makes science so much better than religion, is our faith is shakeable. I'm proud of the fact that there's something I can believe with all my heart to be absolutely true, and the minute there's a bit of evidence that shows it isn't true, I throw it out like yesterday's newspaper. In fact, that's the one thing I recommend, I hope every student has in their experiences sometime in their life, something that they profoundly believe in to be true, based on faith, shown to be wrong, because that opens their mind, and that's what science does that religion doesn't.
If science refutes God, you'd expect that one person who would know that would be Charles Darwin. Charles Darwin has supplied modern atheism with perhaps the strongest argument against God, evolution. And yet when Darwin published his evolution theory, the Harvard biologist, the American biologist Asa Gray wrote Darwin a letter in which he said, as a Christian, I was very inspired upon reading your book, because I have read in the book of Genesis that God made the world and God made man, but there's no information about how this might have occurred. And when I read your book, I understood not only why God made humans, but why there's so much suffering in the world. Evolution helps to account for the reason why there's suffering both for humans but also in the animal kingdom. Darwin was so thrilled at receiving this letter that he published it in future editions of The Origin of Species. So in other words, for Darwin, what actually caused him to lose his own faith, which he did, had nothing to do with evolution. According to Darwin's biographers, and there are many of them, Darwin lost his faith because he lost one of his daughters, Annie. It was a terrible, unexpected death. Darwin blamed God for it and turned against God. It was the issue of suffering, not science, that turned Darwin against God. Now, we're debating here, has science refuted God? And in some senses, we've been talking past each other. If I take a pot of water and put it on the stove, what am I trying to do? I'm trying to make a cup of tea. Now, Lawrence Krauss could come along and say that the molecules are heating up. He could give a full scientific account of what's going on, but he would have completely missed the purpose behind what I'm doing. The scientific explanation doesn't refute the purposeful explanation. It coexists alongside it, and so it is with God. Thank you.
Okay, so it's all in. I have been given the results. Remember, the team that changes the most minds is declared the victor, and here it is. Before the debate, 37% agreed with the motion, 34% were against, and 29% were undecided. Their number went from 37% to 50%. That's a 13% increase. So the team arguing against the motion has to do better than 13%. Let's see how they did. Before the vote, 34%. The second vote, 38%. That's up 4%. It's not enough. The team arguing for the motion, Science Refutes God, has won the debate. Our congratulations to them. Thank you from me, John Donvan, and Intelligence Squared US. We'll see you next time.
Science has refuted God right now.